The Mirror That Burns, a Jungian Journey Through Job. The mirror that burns, that's not poetry. According to Carl Jung, that's psychology. And it's happening right now, in the space between your suffering and your survival. Every night, in emergency rooms and war zones, in divorce courts and cancer wards, the same ancient drama plays out. An innocent person asks, why, and receives only silence. But Jung saw something in that silence that everyone else missed. Not absence, awakening. What if the most faithful man who ever lived, Job, didn't just survive God's test? What if he broke God? What if his suffering was so pure, so undeserved, that it forced the divine to look in a mirror for the first time and recoil in horror? This is the story they don't want you to hear. The psychological thriller hidden inside Scripture, where God isn't the answer, he's the patient. And humanity? We're the therapists he never knew he needed. You're not here by accident. Something in your life has felt like cosmic betrayal, like the universe itself conspired against your goodness. What if I told you that feeling isn't paranoia? It's perception. And what if your pain is the most sacred thing you'll ever experience? Based on Jung's forbidden masterpiece, Answer to Job, this is the journey into the mirror that burns everything it touches, including heaven itself. Chapter 1, The Trial That Never Ends. What kind of justice allows innocence to be sacrificed on the altar of a wager? Job was not a criminal. He was not a rebel. He was righteous, blameless even. Yet the universe turned on him. His wealth vanished, his children died, his body became a battlefield of boils and decay. And through it all, he asked the question we all eventually ask, why me? But silence was his only reply. And in that silence, something shattered, not just in Job, but in heaven. Here's what makes this story terrifying. Job wasn't chosen for his sins. He was chosen for his virtue. Think about that. The most faithful man alive becomes the most tortured. It's like watching the teacher's pet get expelled while the bullies get scholarships. The cosmic order isn't just unfair, it's backwards. Jung saw this not as a religious parable, but as a psychological catastrophe. Job's torment was not the test of a man. It was the exposure of a divine flaw. Yahweh, in Jung's eyes, acted not out of wisdom, but out of pride. A God who could be manipulated by Satan, who needed to prove himself, was not a God of love. He was a being without reflection. And Job, by simply surviving, by refusing to curse the heavens even as they collapsed around him, became the first mirror that forced divinity to look at itself. Picture this, a courtroom in the clouds. God stands as judge and jury. Satan, the accuser, plays the role of prosecutor. And Job is both defendant and evidence. But this isn't justice, it's spectacle. It's a test not of Job's faith, but of God's conscience. And when Job, stripped of everything, still holds his gaze upward, silent but unyielding, something inside Yahweh begins to tremble. Not with rage, but with the first flickers of guilt. But here's the psychological breakthrough Jung identified. Job doesn't just endure, he evolves. While God remains static, defending his actions with thunder and intimidation, Job grows in consciousness. He becomes more aware, more questioning, more human. The servant surpasses the master. This is the moment the trial becomes eternal, because ever since that day, every human who suffers without reason echoes Job's cry. The trial continues in cancer wards, on war-torn streets, in the empty eyes of the grieving. Why? And still, the sky is often silent. But that silence now has context. According to Jung, the divine is not complete, it evolves. And Job was the wound that forced it to begin. Have you ever been punished for doing everything right? Ever felt like your honesty, your goodness, your love was met not with reward, but with ruin? You are not alone. You are part of that trial, a chapter in a divine reckoning that still unfolds. And if Job was the mirror that cracked the sky, what happens when God finally sees what's been hidden there all along? Chapter 2, The Unconscious God. What if the most terrifying truth isn't that God is cruel, but that he's unconscious? That the storms, the floods, the divine wrath we read about are not signs of intention, but of instinct. Raw, blind, reflexive power without reflection. Jung didn't say this lightly. He saw in Yahweh a being of vast might, but limited insight. A force of creation that could destroy without understanding why. Like a lion roaring into the night, unaware that it's crushed its own cub beneath its paw. Imagine a surgeon with the hands of Michelangelo, but the awareness of a sleepwalker. That's Jung's vision of the Old Testament God, infinite power, zero introspection, capable of creating galaxies, incapable of understanding the pain of a single faithful man. The Book of Job isn't about divine justice. It's about divine awakening. Jung interpreted Yahweh's behavior as proof that the Creator had not yet met his own shadow, that he had not yet learned self-awareness, and Job, the man who refused to curse God while cursing his own birth, became the reflective surface through which this awakening began. Think about this. Yahweh never answers Job's accusations. He responds with grandeur, with thunder. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? It's not an answer, it's a deflection, a show of force that masks insecurity. To Jung, this wasn't just divine arrogance, it was unconsciousness. And consciousness, as we know, doesn't begin with answers. It begins with the unbearable question, what have I done? But here's what makes this revelation so unsettling. If God is unconscious, then the universe itself is running on autopilot. Natural disasters aren't divine judgment. They're cosmic accidents. Cancer in children isn't part of a plan. It's chaos wearing the mask of purpose. We've all seen it. The parent who lashes out in anger, then later cries in silence. The leader who makes a decision that costs lives, then cannot sleep. The lover who wounds the one they adore and cannot explain why. In those moments, we are not evil. We are unconscious, acting from shadows we do not yet see. And Jung's radical suggestion is this. Even God had to learn. Even God had to face the shadow. Do you recognize that pattern in yourself? The moments when you hurt someone and only understood it later, with shame, with sorrow? That's not sin, it's unconsciousness becoming light. And if the divine can experience this, so can you. But here's the terrifying beauty of it all. Once the divine begins to awaken, the universe itself starts to change. And that change arrives not through thunder, but through flesh. Chapter 3. The Wound in Heaven. Imagine a moment where power meets remorse, where omnipotence for the first time feels regret. Jung suggests that Job didn't just cry out to the heavens, he pierced them. His suffering carved a wound not in the earth, but in God himself. And through that wound, something ancient and impossible began to bleed. Guilt. It sounds blasphemous, doesn't it? That the Almighty could feel shame. But look deeper. Look past the thunder and into the silence that follows. Yahweh does not answer Job with justice. He restores his fortune, yes, but not his children, not his scarred soul. And he never apologizes. But something changes. In the mythic timeline Jung draws from scripture and psyche, this moment, this confrontation, marks the beginning of a transformation in the divine. It's as if Yahweh, overwhelmed by the mirror Job holds up, steps back and begins to see what he's done. The wound in heaven is not physical, it's moral, a crack in the seamless face of absolute authority. And cracks, as we know, are where the light gets in. Jung saw this as a pivotal psychological shift. Job didn't just survive the trial, he altered the trajectory of divine consciousness, not through war or rebellion, but through endurance, through refusing to surrender the truth of his suffering to a lie about divine justice. Picture a father realizing he's hurt his child, not in a moment of rage, but in a blind act of pride. He cannot undo it, he cannot take the pain away, but he can change. And in that change, a new possibility is born, not retribution, but reconciliation. Have you ever felt that pang, that moment when you realize your strength hurt someone you loved? That's the moment heaven cracked. And Jung's bold vision is this, that in the aftermath of Job, God begins to prepare for something unthinkable, not another test, but a sacrifice, not power, but empathy. And that sacrifice arrives not as thunder, but as a whisper in the womb of a woman. Chapter 4. The Son Who Apologizes. What if Christ wasn't just the Son of God, but God's apology? That's the haunting possibility Jung lays before us. After Job, something shifted in the heavens, not just in myth, but in the collective psyche of humanity. A new figure emerges, gentle, compassionate, crucified. And this figure, Jesus, doesn't descend with lightning. He arrives as an infant, vulnerable, mortal, born not to judge, but to suffer, just like Job. To Jung, Christ isn't merely a redeemer. He's the divine answer to Job's cry, a cosmic gesture of atonement. A God who once demanded obedience now offers himself up. Bleeding, broken, human. This is not weakness. This is transformation. This is the moment the Creator steps inside the pain of his creation. But here's the psychological breakthrough. Christ doesn't just suffer, he suffers voluntarily. Where Job was an unwilling victim, Christ becomes a willing sacrifice. It's the difference between an accident and an apology, between trauma and atonement. Reimagine Golgotha through Jung's eyes. The cross is not just salvation, it is confession. Not with words, but with wounds. It says, I see now what you felt. Where Job suffered alone, Christ suffers for all. Where Yahweh remained above, Christ walks among. Where the old God silenced the broken, the new God becomes the broken. The story now becomes unbearably intimate, a cosmic reversal. The one who once allowed a man to be tested now allows himself to be torn. The father who once watched from afar now experiences nails, thirst, betrayal. And through this, the divine begins to integrate the very qualities it once lacked: humility, empathy, vulnerability. Not in theory, in blood. Think about it. Every parent who has ever hurt their child and then knelt beside their bed at night, watching them sleep, feeling the weight of what they've done, that's the psychological state Jung attributes to God after Job. Christ becomes the divine version of staying up all night, trying to find a way to make it right. Have you ever had someone hurt you, and years later, their child comes to you and says, they never forgot what they did? That ache, that apology, that redemption, that is the Son. Jung wasn't writing blasphemy, he was writing psychology. He was showing us that even the divine story evolves, that justice without compassion must one day face itself. But there's something missing still, because even with the Son, the divine remains unbalanced, still masculine, still power-centered. What's been forgotten is the feminine. Chapter 5, The Missing Queen. In every ancient myth, balance is born from opposites, light and dark, sun and moon, king and queen. But in the God of Job, in Yahweh, there is no queen. No feminine, no wisdom beside the throne, just judgment, just fire. And Jung saw this imbalance not as a minor omission, but as a psychic catastrophe. Because without the feminine, the divine remains incomplete, inflexible, uncompassionate, incapable of true integration. He traces this absence back to the early texts, how Sophia, the spirit of wisdom, once danced beside God in creation, then vanished, silenced, buried beneath centuries of patriarchal theology. And yet, she returns, not in Job's story, but in the quiet evolution that follows, in the rise of Mary, in the mystic visions of the Virgin enthroned beside Christ, in the alchemical texts that whisper of the union between masculine and feminine within the soul and within the heavens. The missing queen is not just a woman, she is what Yahweh lacked: reflection, intuition, compassion that does not need to conquer. Jung understood that the next step in divine development wasn't just guilt or sacrifice, it was integration, a return of the feminine principle, not as helper, but as equal. Only then could God become whole. Only then could the psyche become complete. Have you ever felt like part of you was missing? Like no matter how strong or wise or good you become, there's still a quiet ache, a longing for something softer, deeper, intuitive? That is the call of the queen within you, not weakness, wholeness. And just as the divine began to awaken through Job and Christ, that awakening continues in you. But to complete the journey, the masculine mind must embrace the feminine soul. And this union, this coniunctio oppositorum, is the secret Jung saw hidden in symbols, myths, and dreams. But how do we find this union today, in a world that worships productivity over intuition, dominance over balance? For that, we turn not to heaven, but inward. Chapter 6, The Alchemy of Opposites. In the dark corners of medieval labs and ancient manuscripts, a secret was hidden, not just of gold, but of the soul. Alchemy wasn't about turning lead into treasure. It was about turning suffering into transformation. And Jung saw in its strange symbols and coded formulas the very process that Job had endured: the union of opposites, the burning of the ego, the birth of the self. The alchemists spoke of the coniunctio oppositorum, the sacred marriage of sun and moon, fire and water, masculine and feminine. In religious language, these ideas sound mythical. But in psychological terms, they describe the moment when all parts of you, your light and shadow, your logic and feeling, begin to integrate. Job's suffering, that was the fire. Christ's compassion, the water, the missing queen, the mystery. Alchemy shows us that these must not compete, but combine. Jung didn't invent this idea. He unearthed it, Buried beneath dogma and doctrine, he found in alchemy the forgotten map of inner evolution. He saw that Job's endurance, Christ's sacrifice, and Sophia's return all point to the same crucible. The self must burn to become whole. But unlike religion, this isn't a path handed down from on high. It's a path discovered through pain, through dreams, through symbols rising from your unconscious like stars emerging in a night sky. Imagine it, your inner world as a hidden laboratory, your trauma as the furnace, your guilt, your joy, your rage, all ingredients in the great work. You are not meant to choose sides within yourself. You are meant to melt them together, not balance, fusion. Have you ever felt at war with yourself, like your ambition suffocates your tenderness, or your kindness silences your truth? That tension, that heat, is the start of alchemy. And Jung's gift was this. He gave us language to name it, process to survive it, meaning to emerge from it. But alchemy is not the end. It is only the map. The real transformation happens where the symbols meet real life. And for that, we turn to the language of the soul, dreams. Chapter 7. The dreams that speak when God won't. When the sky is silent, the soul begins to whisper. And those whispers come in dreams, strange, symbolic, unforgettable. Jung believed that dreams are not random flickers of thought, but messages from the unconscious, letters from the forgotten self. And in a world where God once spoke through burning bushes and thunder, Jung dared to say, now he speaks in your sleep. After the trauma of Job, after the crucifixion, after the centuries of silence and theology, the divine doesn't disappear. It descends, not into dogma, but into the individual psyche. And in dreams, we meet what Jung called the archetypes, the universal symbols that live in all of us. The wise old man, the devouring mother, the hero, the serpent. These aren't just characters, they're mirrors. And through them, we begin to process what logic cannot contain. Here's the startling truth. Your dreams often know you better than you know yourself. They reveal desires you've denied, fears you've buried, truths you've avoided. They don't lie. They don't flatter. They simply show you what is, beneath the masks, beneath the roles, beneath the story you tell yourself about who you are. Job's story ends without full resolution, but Jung knew why, because the story continues in you. Every night you dream of falling, of being chased, of standing before something immense and unnameable. You're stepping into the same sacred space Job entered when he cried, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. The dream is your burning bush now, your still, small voice. Have you ever had a dream you couldn't forget? One that felt more real than waking life? One that frightened you, not because it was evil, but because it was true? That's not your imagination, that's your soul knocking. Jung taught us not to decode dreams like puzzles, but to enter them like temples. They don't tell you what to think. They show you what you've hidden. Consider this. While psychologists try to explain dreams as neural noise, Jung saw them as divine communication, not from above, but from within. The God who once spoke from mountains now whispers from the depths of your unconscious. And every symbol, every recurring image, every nightmare is a breadcrumb leading you back to wholeness. But beware, dreams will not flatter you. They will confront you. Like Job's suffering, they are often painful, because their goal is not comfort, it's integration. And through that process, you come face to face with something far older than religion, the self, the spark of wholeness buried beneath your wounds. But what happens when dreams go unheeded, when the unconscious speaks and no one listens? For that, we must face the cost of divine silence and its modern echo. Chapter 8. The Modern Echo of Divine Silence. Silence used to be sacred. Now it's terrifying. In a world wired for constant connection, divine silence feels like abandonment. But it's not just spiritual seekers who feel this. Soldiers returning from war, survivors of abuse, children raised in violent homes, all ask the same question Job once did. Why didn't anyone stop it? Where was the voice? Where was the answer? Jung warned us that when silence replaces meaning, the psyche fractures. The same psychological wound Job endured is being repeated today, not through religious persecution, but through emotional neglect, systemic betrayal, and the cold algorithms of modern life. We no longer sacrifice animals on altars. We sacrifice attention to noise and truth to productivity. We scream into the digital void and get silence back. Here's the haunting parallel. Job lost his children, his wealth, his health. Today we lose our attention, our purpose, our connection to meaning. Job sat in ashes. We scroll through endless feeds. Job cried out to a silent sky. We post into algorithmic darkness. The wound is the same, just digitized. But silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's pressure, a pregnant pause, a call to turn inward. Jung saw in divine silence not neglect, but necessity. Because until we become conscious enough to interpret it, the self must speak through suffering. Silence forces us to look inside, where the symbols, the dreams, the archetypes are waiting. It demands we grow. Imagine someone walking through tragedy and hearing nothing in return. Not from friends, not from family, not from God. And yet, a year later, they paint something, or write something, or hold someone's hand in a way that saves a life. That's the response. Not in words, in transformation. Think about the most profound moments of your life. Weren't they often preceded by silence? The quiet before the breakthrough, the emptiness before the insight, the dark night before the dawn. What if silence isn't punishment, but preparation? Have you ever asked a question no one could answer? Sat in the darkness so long that you began to hear something faint, but real? That's not madness. That's the psyche stepping forward to do what heaven once did. To speak in metaphors, to carve symbols from silence, to offer not answers, but connection. But connection requires courage, and courage requires community. Because if we try to carry the burden of Job alone, we risk collapsing under its weight. The next evolution isn't isolation, it's recognition. And that begins when we stop seeing suffering as weakness, and start seeing it as the fire that forges integration. So, how do we build that bridge in a world built to distract us from ourselves? For that, we turn to the rebels, the ones who broke the script and rewrote the rules of inner healing. Chapter 9. The Rebels Who Wrote Scripture in Scars. Some revolutions don't begin with a bang. They begin with a breakdown. They begin when someone says, "No more lies," even if their voice shakes. Jung believed that figures like Job, like Christ, and like modern whistleblowers of the soul, all share a single trait. They refuse to agree with a narrative that betrays the truth of their experience. They rebel, not with weapons, but with reflection. These rebels aren't always saints. Sometimes they're burned-out therapists, or poets who never published, or mothers who refuse to keep silent about what happened behind closed doors. They are the ones who confront the system, religious, cultural, familial, and ask, does anyone see what this is doing to us? In doing so, they risk everything, belonging, reputation, even sanity. But they also awaken something ancient, the right to rewrite the story. Jung saw Job as the first of these rebels, not because he cursed God, but because he didn't lie. He didn't say, it's all part of the plan. He said, this is wrong. And in that truth, he became the first therapist of the divine, the first man to hold up a mirror to a force so vast it had never seen itself clearly before. Now imagine this happening today. A young woman leaves the cult she was raised in, writes a book about religious trauma, and is exiled by her family, but finds her words heal thousands. A veteran speaks out against the institution he once served, not to attack it, but to redeem its soul. These are not just stories, they are modern echoes of the Job archetype, and each of them risks the same thing, crucifixion before redemption. Have you ever spoken a truth that cost you everything? Told your story and watched people look away, afraid of what it revealed? That is the scar of the sacred rebel. It burns, but it also guides. You are not breaking the story, you are helping it evolve. But rebels don't just destroy, they point towards something new. And what lies beyond rebellion is the transformation of meaning itself, the kind of healing that rewrites reality from the inside out. And that begins with the self. Chapter 10. The Self That Survives the Fire. In the depths of suffering, something ancient awakens. Not the ego, that brittle shell that clings to control, but the self, the capital S, self. Jung called it the totality of who we are and who we could become. Not just the conscious mind, but the shadow, the soul, the divine spark hidden beneath trauma and masks. And it is this self, not God, not the church, not society, that ultimately carries you through the fire. The ego screams when everything falls apart, but the self listens. The ego bargains, the self watches. And when the world goes silent, when even God won't speak, the self steps forward like a second skin made of light and ash. It doesn't fix the pain, it contains it, and in doing so, it transforms it. Job had every reason to collapse. He lost everything: his wealth, his children, his health, his community. But what he didn't lose was that still, stubborn core that refused to lie. That refused to say he deserved it. That is the self, not loud, not victorious, but indestructible. Modern psychology often tries to fix the ego. Jung wasn't interested in that. He wanted you to meet what's behind it, because that meeting changes everything. It's the difference between asking, "How do I stop this pain?" and "Who is being born through it?" Have you ever reached a point where you could no longer explain your pain, but still found yourself breathing, still walking, still holding the line of your truth? That wasn't luck, that was the self, the part of you that doesn't break, that burns and survives. But this isn't the end of the journey, because the self doesn't exist in isolation. It seeks integration with the world, with others, with meaning. And meaning isn't something we inherit, it's something we create. And that creation begins with the question, what story will I tell now that the old one has turned to ash? Chapter 11. The story you write from ashes. When the old myths fail you, when the answers don't come, when the prayers echo back empty, you are left with silence and smoke. And from that silence, a terrible freedom is born, the power to write a new story. Not one handed down from mountains or prophets, but one carved from your own wounds. Jung believed this is the moment where psychology becomes sacred, where the individual soul is no longer a servant to external authority, but the author of its own myth. Job's story doesn't end with revenge or clarity. It ends with restoration, but not because God explained himself, because Job endured. And in that endurance, he outlived the story that tried to define him. Here's the radical truth. You are not a character in someone else's story. You are the author, the protagonist, and the editor of your own narrative. The trauma that tried to write victim across your forehead, you get to cross that out and write survivor. The failure that whispered worthless, you get to rewrite it as learning. In the same way, every person who has faced spiritual trauma, betrayal, or inner collapse stands at a crossroads. Continue the old script or write a new one. But this rewriting isn't fantasy. It's responsibility. Because once you stop waiting for meaning to descend from above, you must begin building it from within. Imagine someone raised to believe their pain was a punishment, only to realize years later that it was the source of their greatest compassion. Or someone told their questions were sinful, who now teaches others how to listen deeply. These are not miracles. These are rewrites, revisions of the soul's contract. But here's what makes this terrifying. When you become the author of your own story, you also become responsible for its ending. No one else gets to write your conclusion. Not your parents, not your church, not your trauma. Just you, with whatever broken pencil life has left you. Have you begun your rewrite? Have you started saying, "This happened to me, but it doesn't get to define me"? That is the story that rises from ash. Not clean, not perfect, but real. Authored not by gods, but by survivors. And when enough people write new stories, something larger shifts, not just in culture, in the collective unconscious. Because as Jung knew, the myth of the future is born in the dream of the individual. And those dreams, those raw, cracked, unpolished stories, are how we begin to heal what heaven never finished. But healing isn't just personal, it echoes. And when we speak that new truth aloud, we become what Jung always believed we were meant to be. Not sheep in a fold, but mirrors with fire inside. So, how do we build that bridge in a world built to distract us from ourselves? For that, we turn to the rebels, the ones who broke the script and rewrote the rules of inner healing. Chapter 12, The Mirror with Fire Inside. There's a reason mirrors appear in myths, dreams, and nightmares. They don't just reflect, they reveal. And sometimes what they reveal is too much to bear. Jung believed that each of us holds such a mirror within. But unlike ordinary glass, this one burns. Because it doesn't show your face, it shows your truth, your shadow, your potential, your unfinished evolution. Job held that mirror up to heaven, and the divine recoiled. But what most forget is that Job survived, and in surviving, he became the template, the prototype for every soul who chooses to look, really look at their own contradictions, their own light, their own darkness. That's the real miracle. Not healing, not redemption, but vision. This inner mirror isn't polite. It doesn't flatter. It shows you what you've become and what you've denied. It shows the child still trapped inside your adult decisions. It shows the rage hidden beneath your kindness, the hunger behind your discipline. And when you accept all of it, not just the parts that win applause, you ignite. That's what Jung called individuation, not perfection, wholeness. Picture someone who finally stops running, who turns inward and sees their pain not as failure, but as fuel. And from that moment on, they no longer chase validation. They radiate presence. Not because they've healed everything, but because they've accepted it all. That's the mirror with fire inside, and that's what makes you unshakable. Have you dared to look into your mirror, to sit with the reflection long enough for the heat to become light? Most won't. They'll keep polishing the surface, trying to erase the cracks. But those cracks are where the story gets in, where the archetypes live, where the self waits. And once you become that mirror, you don't just reflect, you awaken others. You carry the wound of Job, the endurance of Christ, the wisdom of Sophia, all within your gaze. And that gaze changes everything. But reflection alone isn't enough. Fire must become form. And for that, we step into the final transformation, turning your inner myth into a lived reality. Chapter 13. The Myth You Become. There comes a moment in every journey when the story is no longer something you read or analyze or even rewrite. It becomes you, not as metaphor, as movement, as breath. The mirror you once held now lives behind your eyes, and every step you take, every word you speak, becomes a living scripture carved from your own becoming. Jung knew that myths aren't just old stories. They are living patterns, blueprints of transformation etched into the unconscious. And when a person integrates their shadow, embraces their pain, and dares to walk forward as a whole being, that person no longer follows a myth. They embody one. Job was not just a man. He was a structure, a path, a psychic architecture. And Christ was not just a savior. He was a symbol of what happens when divine power fuses with human suffering. Sophia, the forgotten feminine, is not just a goddess. She is the return of balance. And you are all of them, if you choose to live it. This is the quiet revolution Jung proposed, that healing isn't about escape, it's about embodiment. You don't leave your pain behind. You carry it like stained glass, every shard transformed into color, into meaning, into radiance. You don't wait for heaven to tell you who you are. You walk as if the kingdom was within you, because it is. Have you ever felt the pull to stop searching and start walking? To act not because you have all the answers, but because something in you has survived enough to know, I am the answer now? That's not arrogance, that's initiation. The moment you step from mirror to myth, from seeker to symbol, from story to soul. But there is one last piece, one final act in this Jungian gospel. Because once you become the myth, you must return, not for your sake, but for the world. And what you bring back is fire, turned into light. Chapter 14. The fire you bring back. Every true myth ends not with escape, but with return. The hero doesn't stay in the cave. The prophet doesn't vanish into the clouds. They come back, scarred, wiser, burning with something the world didn't have before. And so must you, because the real purpose of suffering, of shadow, of spiritual descent, is not just survival, it's transmutation. The fire that nearly consumed you becomes the torch you carry. Jung saw this in every great transformation. The alchemist returns to the village not with gold, but with insight. The dreamer awakens not with fantasy, but with direction. Job, restored yet changed, becomes not just a man of fortune again, but a man who knows the silence of heaven and still lives with open hands. That knowing changes you, and it changes those around you. The fire you bring back is not about teaching or preaching. It's presence. It's how you sit with someone's pain without needing to fix it. It's how you listen without fear. It's the look in your eye that says, I've been there, and I didn't vanish. In a world starving for authenticity, that is power. And that power doesn't shout. It glows. But here's the paradox. The fire you carry isn't yours to keep. It's meant to light other candles. Every person you meet who's struggling in darkness becomes an opportunity to share what you've learned. Not as a guru, but as a fellow traveler who's walked that particular path before. Have you ever been around someone who's suffered deeply and somehow made you feel safer just by being there? That's the fire, not burning outward, but illuminating. It's what happens when you face the divine silence, the collapse of meaning, the terror of your own shadow, and came back with love instead of bitterness. Think about this. Every great spiritual teacher, every profound healer, every person who truly changes lives, they all share one thing. They've been broken. They've walked through their own version of Job's trial, and they've chosen to transform their wound into wisdom, their scar into service. This is the final turn of the spiral, from the trial of Job to the crucifixion of Christ, from the forgotten queen to the mirror with fire inside. You now become the bearer, the one who brings myth to life, not in theory, but in gesture, in relationship, in being. And if enough of us carry this fire, quietly, steadily, without needing to convert or conquer, then something begins to shift, not in heaven, but here, in the collective soul, in the stories we tell, in the world we build next. Because ultimately, the answer to Job is you. Call to action. The flame in your hands. You've just walked through fire, not a fire of destruction, but of revelation. Across 14 insights, you've seen the face of suffering not as a curse, but as a mirror. You've witnessed Job's trial become a divine awakening. You've watched Yahweh tremble, Christ descend, Sophia return, and the self rise. And through it all, a single truth has emerged. The mirror that burns also transforms. This wasn't theology. It was initiation. This wasn't a summary of Jung's answer to Job. It was the unwritten gospel hiding inside it. And now, it belongs to you. Because every insight was never just about the past. It was about you, the listener, the seeker, the mirror. But here's what makes this moment dangerous. Knowledge without action is just entertainment. And you've been given more than knowledge. You've been handed fire. The question now is, what will you do with it? If this journey stirred something in you, if it named a pain you've carried in silence, or lit a match in a place you thought had gone dark, then don't let it end here. Share your scar. Tell your job moment in the comments. Someone out there needs your mirror to survive their own fire. Because here's the secret Jung knew. When you share your wound, it becomes a doorway. When you speak your truth, you give others permission to speak theirs. When you stop hiding your brokenness, you become a lighthouse for every soul still lost at sea. Subscribe if you're ready for more stories that don't just educate, but awaken. Hit that notification bell if you want to be part of a community that sees suffering not as shame, but as sacred. And share this with someone who's been told their questions make them dangerous. They're not. They make them whole. The comments section below isn't just for discussion. It's for confession, for courage, for connection. Tell us, what is your job moment? What wound are you ready to transform into wisdom? Your story might be the mirror someone else needs to survive their fire. And remember, the wound is not where the story ends. It's where the light begins.